"You're making a mistake," Father Elijah Brooks said quietly, just as the first set of handcuffs clicked in the middle of the Easter hymn. The sound sharp and out of place against the soft rise of voices and the low hum of the organ, and for a brief second the entire church seemed to inhale at once, frozen between disbelief and fear. Sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows in long bands of gold and crimson that stretched across the polished wooden floor, catching on the white fabric of Elijah's robe where a small child clung to him, trembling, his tiny fingers gripping the cloth as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly shifted. And Elijah didn't pull away, didn't resist, didn't even raise his voice. He simply lowered his head slightly, his hand resting gently on the child's shoulder, steady, grounding, present, while the officers moved with rigid precision, their dark uniforms cutting through the softness of the sacred space, boots echoing against the floor in measured steps that felt louder than they should have, as if the building itself were listening. And near the front aisle, Officer Daniel Hayes stood tall, his jaw set, his eyes fixed forward with the kind of certainty that left no room for doubt, or questions, or second chances, the kind of certainty that came from years of believing he was always on the right side of the line. And yet something flickered there, something almost imperceptible, when Elijah finally looked up and met his gaze, not with anger, not with fear, but with a calm that didn't match the moment, a calm that made the air feel heavier, as though truth itself had weight, pressing gently but firmly against everything unfolding, and around them. Whispers began to ripple through the congregation, hushed voices layering over the fading hymn, phones slowly rising, screens glowing faintly in the dim light as people tried to make sense of what they were seeing. A priest in the middle of Easter Mass being led away, a child refusing to let go, a silence growing louder than any shout, and Elijah, still composed, leaned slightly toward the boy and murmured something too soft to be heard, something that made the child's grip loosen just enough for him to be guided gently aside by a woman in the front pew, her hands careful, her expression shaken but kind. And then Elijah straightened, the cuffs secure around his wrists now, the cold metal catching a sliver of sunlight as he was turned toward the aisle. And still, he didn't resist, didn't plead, didn't explain. He simply took a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling beneath the white robe, and began to walk, each step measured, deliberate, as though he were choosing to carry something unseen with him, something heavier than accusation, heavier than judgment. While behind him, the music had stopped completely, leaving only the faint creak of wood, the distant hum of the city beyond the church walls, and the quiet, unsettling feeling that whatever had just begun inside that room was far from over. The patrol car door closed with a dull, final thud that seemed to seal the morning behind him, and for a moment Father Elijah Brooks simply sat there, hands resting quietly in his lap, the faint scent of old leather and disinfectant filling the confined space as sunlight flickered through the window in passing fragments, broken by the slow movement of trees and power lines outside, each shadow brushing across his face like a silent question he did not rush to answer. And across from him, Officer Daniel Hayes adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if looking anywhere else might invite doubt. Yet the image lingered, the child's small hands clutching white fabric, the stillness in Elijah's voice, the absence of resistance that felt less like compliance and more like something deliberate, something chosen. And Hayes shifted slightly in his seat, the radio crackling low with distant chatter that he ignored, because the quiet between them felt louder than any dispatch call. And after a few miles he finally spoke, his tone controlled but edged with something he could not quite name, asking why a man like Elijah would interfere in an active investigation, why he would step in front of officers, why he would refuse to step aside when told. And Elijah listened without interruption, his gaze steady but not confrontational, as if he were hearing more than just the words being spoken. And when he responded, his voice remained even, almost gentle, saying that sometimes the law arrives before the truth has time to breathe. And Hayes exhaled through his nose, a short, restrained sound, dismissing the statement as deflection, as philosophy where facts should be. Yet he did not press further, because something in Elijah's tone carried weight without force, conviction without volume. And the car continued forward, tires humming softly against asphalt as the city shifted around them from quiet residential streets to wider roads lined with storefronts just beginning to open for the day, neon signs flickering to life, early morning traffic building in steady rhythm, and inside the vehicle the silence returned, thicker now, layered with everything unsaid. While at the station the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Elijah was guided inside, the brightness stark, compared to the warm glow of the church, casting sharp lines across tiled floors and pale walls that held no memory of hymns or stained glass. Only procedure, only order. And yet even here Elijah's presence did not fracture. He moved with the same measured calm, the same unhurried breath, as though the space itself could not dictate who he was. And as he was seated on a narrow bench, hands still bound, he closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat but in reflection, as if gathering something from within rather than searching for it outside. While across the room Hayes watched from a distance, arms crossed, the official report already forming in his mind, clear, structured, justified, and still, beneath that structure, something unsettled remained, a quiet disruption he could not file away, not yet, not when the image of that child's fear and Elijah's steady presence refused to fade, lingering instead like a question waiting for its moment to be heard. By late morning the station had settled into its usual rhythm of ringing phones and quiet footsteps, yet something in the air remained unsettled, as though the morning had left behind a trace that refused to fade, and Father Elijah Brooks sat where he had been placed, the metal bench cool beneath him, his posture unchanged, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, as if time moved differently around him, while a few officers passed by with brief glances that lingered just a second longer than necessary, curiosity threading through their otherwise routine expressions. And across the room Officer Daniel Hayes stood near a desk, flipping through a thin file that felt lighter than it should have, its contents sparse, incomplete in a way that did not match the certainty he had carried into the church earlier that day. And he frowned slightly, scanning the same page again, noticing the absence of details that should have been there, the missing pieces that left the narrative too clean, too simple, and he tapped the folder lightly against his palm before walking over to the evidence desk where a younger officer sat typing, asking in a low voice if any additional statements had come in regarding the child from the church, and the officer shook his head, explaining that no formal complaint had been filed yet, that the situation was still being processed, still waiting for confirmation, and Hayes nodded, though the answer did not settle anything inside him. And when he glanced back toward Elijah, he found the man looking not at anyone in particular, but at the far wall, where a narrow window allowed a thin line of daylight to stretch across the floor. And for a moment Hayes hesitated before walking over, his steps slower this time, less rigid, and he stopped a few feet away, studying Elijah as if expecting to find something different up close, something that would justify the morning's actions without question. But what he found instead was the same quiet presence, the same calm that did not challenge or retreat. And Hayes spoke again, this time less sharp, asking directly who the child was and why Elijah had stepped in, and Elijah turned his head slightly, meeting his gaze with a steady clarity that felt almost disarming. And he answered that the child had come to the church seeking safety, not answers, not explanations, just a place where fear could settle without being questioned. And Hayes pressed further, asking, what kind of danger would lead a child into a church during a crowded service? And Elijah paused for a brief second, not searching for words but weighing them, before saying that sometimes the loudest places are where people go when they are trying to be seen without being noticed. And the answer lingered between them, incomplete, yet heavy with implication, and Hayes shifted his stance, the file still in his hand, feeling for the first time that the situation was moving beyond the clean lines of protocol into something less defined, something that required more than procedure to understand. And across the station the sounds continued, phones ringing, printers humming, voices low and steady, but within that space a quiet tension had begun to take shape, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a surface that once seemed unbreakable. And Hayes found himself looking again at the thin file, then back at Elijah, and realizing that whatever story, he thought he understood that morning was no longer holding together the way it should. The clock on the station wall ticked past 11 with a steady, mechanical rhythm that seemed louder than it should have, each second marking time that no longer felt routine, and Officer Daniel Hayes stood at his desk staring at the open file again. The edges of the paper slightly curled beneath his fingers, as if the document itself resisted being flattened into something simple, something final. And across the room, Father Elijah Brooks remained seated, the same quiet stillness surrounding him, like a boundary no one could quite cross. And then a voice cut through the low hum of the station, sharp but controlled, calling Hayes over to the front desk where a woman stood with her hands clasped tightly together, her coat still on despite the warmth inside, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Elijah. And for a brief moment something shifted in her expression, not fear, not confusion, but recognition mixed with urgency. And Hayes approached with measured steps, his posture returning to its familiar authority as he asked how he could help. And the woman introduced herself as Mrs. Carter, a volunteer from the church, her voice steady but carrying a weight that did not belong to small talk. And she explained that the child from the service had not left with family, had not been claimed by anyone after the incident, and that before everything unfolded the child had stayed close to Elijah, refusing to speak to anyone else. And Hayes listened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the information, because it did not align with the assumption that had driven his actions earlier, and he asked if the child had given a name, an address, anything that could clarify the situation, and Mrs. Carter shook her head, saying only that the child had whispered something to Elijah before the officers arrived, something she could not fully hear, but enough to understand that the child was asking not to be sent back, and the words settled into the space between them, quiet but unmistakable, and Hayes felt a subtle tightening in his chest, a reaction he did not immediately acknowledge, and he glanced over at Elijah again, who now looked back with the same calm presence, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had already been carrying this truth before anyone else had begun to question it. And Hayes turned back to Mrs. Carter, his voice lower now, asking why she had come here instead of waiting for official updates. And she answered simply that some things do not wait for paperwork, that sometimes people show up because something does not feel right. And the statement lingered longer than expected, echoing softly against the structured environment of the station. And Hayes exhaled slowly, nodding once as he thanked her, though his mind was already moving ahead, connecting fragments that refused to stay separate. And as she stepped back, her gaze briefly meeting Elijah's again, there was a silent understanding exchanged, something unspoken but clear, and Hayes noticed it, felt it, even if he could not fully define it. And when he turned back toward his desk, the file in his hand no longer felt like a conclusion but the beginning of something unresolved, something that required more than assumption, more than authority. And as he stood there, the noise of the station fading slightly into the background, he realized that the line between procedure and truth was no longer as clear as it had been that morning. And for the first time since the church doors had opened, he hesitated not because he lacked answers, but because he was beginning to understand that he might have been asking the wrong questions all along. The air inside the station felt tighter now, as if the walls themselves had drawn a fraction closer, and Officer Daniel Hayes stood still for a moment longer than usual, the file resting unopened on his desk while the weight of Mrs. Carter's words settled deeper than he expected. And across the room Father Elijah Brooks remained composed, but there was something in the stillness that had shifted, not outwardly, not in posture or expression, but in the quiet gravity of the moment, as if everything was slowly turning toward a point no one could yet see clearly. And Hayes finally moved, not with the sharp precision from earlier, but with a slower, more deliberate pace, walking back toward Elijah, each step carrying a question he had not yet formed into words. And when he stopped in front of him, he did not stand as rigidly as before, his shoulders slightly lowered, his tone measured but no longer edged with the same certainty. And he asked again about the child, not as an accusation but as an attempt to understand. And Elijah lifted his gaze, meeting him with that same steady calm, though now there was a faint trace of something else beneath it, something heavier, something that had been waiting. And he spoke quietly, explaining that the child had come into the church before the service began, sitting near the back, watching the doors more than the altar, as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. And when Elijah approached, the child had not asked for help directly, had not explained anything in full sentences, but had said enough, just enough to make one thing clear. that going back was not safe. And Hayes listened, his jaw tightening slightly as he processed the words, because they did not fit the report, did not fit the call that had been made, did not fit the urgency that had justified immediate action, and he asked what exactly the child had said, pressing for something concrete, something he could write down, something he could hold on to. And Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes lowering briefly as if recalling the exact tone rather than just the words. And then he answered, saying the child had whispered, "Please do not let them find me." And the sentence lingered in the air longer than it should have. Simple, but weighted. And Hayes felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that did not align with procedure, something that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding. And he turned slightly, glancing toward the hallway where the holding rooms were located, where the absence of the child now felt louder than any presence. And for a brief second he hesitated, caught between the structure he trusted and the uncertainty growing in front of him. And when he looked back at Elijah, there was a flicker of something unfamiliar in his expression, not doubt fully formed, but the beginning of it. And Elijah, noticing it, did not push, did not argue. He simply held that same quiet ground, as if understanding that realization could not be forced, only allowed to arrive. And across the station the routine continued, phones ringing, officers moving, paperwork being filed. But within that movement a fracture had begun to form, subtle but undeniable, and Hayes felt it, not as a break in authority, but as a question pressing against it, asking whether the action taken that morning had protected something or overlooked it entirely. And for the first time since the church doors had opened, the certainty he carried no longer felt solid, but fragile, as if one more piece of truth might be enough to break it completely. The station seemed to slow without anyone announcing it, as if time itself had decided to hesitate alongside Officer Daniel Hayes, who now stood by the narrow window at the far end of the room, the pale daylight cutting across his uniform in a thin, quiet line, and he watched dust drift through that beam of light, small particles suspended between motion and stillness. And for the first time that day, he was not thinking about reports or procedures or outcomes. He was thinking about a single sentence, soft and fragile. "Please do not let them find me." And the words repeated in his mind with a clarity that refused to fade. And behind him the steady rhythm of the station continued, phones ringing, keyboards tapping, voices rising and falling in routine patterns, but all of it felt distant now, muted beneath something heavier, something that had settled into his chest and would not move. And across the room Father Elijah Brooks sat with his eyes partially closed, not asleep, not withdrawn, but present in a way that felt deeper than the noise around him, his breathing slow, measured, his hands resting loosely, and the overhead lights cast a soft glow across his face, flattening shadows, leaving only stillness. And Hayes turned slightly, his gaze lingering on him longer than before, not searching for guilt now, but for understanding, and he walked back, slower than any step he had taken that morning, stopping a few feet away without speaking at first, as if the silence itself needed space to unfold. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of its earlier edge, asking what Elijah believed would happen if the child had been taken away. And Elijah opened his eyes fully this time, meeting Hayes with a calm that did not feel distant, but close, grounded. And he answered without hesitation, saying that sometimes fear speaks before truth has evidence, and if you ignore it, you do not just lose the truth, you lose the person carrying it. And Hayes stood there, the words settling slowly, not striking, not shocking, but pressing inward with quiet persistence. And he looked away for a moment, his jaw tightening slightly as he exhaled, the breath heavier than before. And beyond the glass door of the station the afternoon had begun to take shape, sunlight shifting angles, shadows stretching longer across the pavement, cars passing in steady streams, life continuing without pause. And yet inside that room something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, something small but irreversible, like the first crack in ice that signals what will eventually break. And Hayes glanced back toward the desk where the thin file still lay, untouched, now insufficient, and then toward the hallway again, where absence lingered, where questions had begun to gather. And when he returned his gaze to Elijah, there was no longer the distance of authority between them, only the quiet recognition that this moment was no longer about control, but about what had been overlooked, and Hayes drew a slow breath, steadying himself not for action, but for something more difficult, something that required him to step beyond certainty and into doubt. And as the light shifted slightly across the floor, he realized that the silence between them was no longer empty, it was waiting. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until a sharp voice from the front desk cut through the air, calling for Officer Hayes with a tone that carried urgency beneath its restraint, and he turned immediately, the hesitation from moments before replaced by instinct as he moved across the room, his steps quicker now, more focused. And when he reached the desk, the young officer there held out a tablet, the screen glowing faintly with a paused video, the timestamp blinking in the corner, and Hayes frowned slightly as he took it, asking where it came from. And the officer explained it had just been uploaded online, already spreading, recorded from inside the church that morning, but from a different angle, one that had not been part of any official report. And Hayes tapped the screen, the video resuming with a soft flicker of motion, the familiar interior of the church appearing again, the stained glass casting colored light across the floor, the sound of distant singing barely audible. But this time the frame did not center on Elijah. It shifted slightly to the side, capturing the child more clearly, capturing the moment before everything escalated. And Hayes watched as the child stepped closer to Elijah, small hands trembling, eyes darting toward the entrance. And though the audio was faint, the body language spoke louder than any words, the tension, the urgency, the silent plea that had gone unnoticed in the chaos that followed. And then the camera caught something else, something subtle but undeniable, a figure. Near the back doors, partially obscured, watching, not participating, not intervening, just watching. And Hayes leaned closer to the screen, his brow tightening as he replayed that section, slowing it down, noticing the way the figure shifted back as the officers entered, the way the child's posture changed instantly, shrinking, retreating, and the connection formed not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet alignment of details that could no longer be ignored, and the room around him seemed to fade. Again, the noise dulling as focus narrowed, and he looked up briefly, his gaze finding Elijah across the station, who remained seated, calm, as if the truth had already arrived long before the evidence did. And Hayes turned back to the tablet, replaying the clip once more, this time not as confirmation of what he already believed, but as a challenge to it. And each second of footage pressed against the certainty he had carried into that church, reshaping it, fragment by fragment, until it no longer held. And the officer beside him asked quietly what it meant, but Hayes did not answer immediately, because the meaning was not simple. It was not contained within the frame of a single video. It stretched beyond it, into the decisions made, the assumptions trusted, the actions taken without pause. And he finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, before handing the tablet back, his expression no longer rigid, no longer certain, but something else entirely, something closer to realization. And as he turned again toward Elijah, the space between them felt different now, not divided by authority, but connected by a truth that was beginning to surface, one that would not stay quiet, one that had already begun to move, quietly but relentlessly, toward the moment where it could no longer be ignored. The realization did not arrive with noise or sudden movement. It settled quietly, like a weight that could no longer be shifted aside, and Officer Daniel Hayes stood still for a moment after handing back the tablet, his eyes lowering briefly as if the ground beneath him had changed in a way he had not prepared for. And across the station the routine continued, but now it felt distant, almost irrelevant, because the truth had begun to surface in a form that could not be dismissed as speculation or doubt. It had shape, it had movement, it had been seen. And Hayes turned slowly, his gaze finding Father Elijah Brooks once more. And this time there was no hesitation in his steps as he walked toward him, not driven by authority, but by something far more difficult, the need to face what he had not seen before. And when he stopped in front of him, the silence between them held a different weight, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but heavy with recognition. And Hayes spoke, his voice lower, stripped of its earlier certainty, acknowledging that the video had shown something that had been missed, something that changed the understanding of what happened inside the church. and Elijah listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, calm but attentive, as if he had been waiting not for the apology, but for the moment of clarity itself. And Hayes continued, explaining that the figure in the background, the one who had gone unnoticed in the initial response, was now being identified, that internal review had already been initiated, that questions were being asked not just about the incident, but about the actions taken. And as he spoke, the structure he once relied on began to shift, not collapsing, but opening, revealing gaps that could no longer remain hidden. And he paused briefly, searching for words that did not come easily, before saying that the arrest may have been based on incomplete understanding, and the admission hung in the air, quiet but undeniable, and Elijah held his gaze, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with something steadier, something rooted in the same calm that had never left him. And he responded simply, saying that truth does not rush, it waits for those willing to see it. And Hayes exhaled slowly, the breath carrying more than just air, carrying the weight of everything that had shifted since the morning. And for the first time he stepped back, not to create distance, but to allow space for what needed to happen next. And across the room a senior officer approached, his expression serious, his voice low, as he spoke to Hayes about next steps, about statements, about the need to correct what had been set in motion. And Hayes nodded, but his attention remained divided, because the moment was no longer about procedure alone. It was about responsibility, about acknowledging the impact of decisions made too quickly. And as the conversation continued, the tension that had once filled the room began to change, not disappearing, but transforming into something quieter, more focused, like a shift from noise to clarity. And Elijah, still seated, watched without interruption, his presence unchanged, his stillness now carrying a different meaning, not just patience, but quiet endurance. And as Hayes turned back once more, there was no longer a barrier between them, only the recognition that what had happened could not be undone, but what followed could still be shaped. And in that space, between action and consequence, something rare began to take form, not power, not control, but accountability. Slow, difficult, and impossible to ignore. The afternoon light had shifted by the time the decision was made, stretching longer across the station floor, softer now, less harsh, as if even the day itself had eased its grip. And the sound that followed was not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet, unmistakable click of metal being removed, a small action that carried far more weight than it should have. And Father Elijah Brooks lowered his hands slowly, not with relief, not with urgency, but with the same measured calm that had never left him, as if the moment was not about being freed, but about something deeper finally aligning. And Officer Daniel Hayes stood just a few feet away, his posture no longer rigid, his expression no longer shielded by certainty, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar. And for a brief second, he seemed to search for something to say, something that could bridge what had happened and what was now understood. But the words did not come easily, and instead he gave a small nod, not formal, not procedural, but personal, a quiet acknowledgement of what could not be undone. And Elijah returned the gesture with the slightest incline of his head, no anger, no demand, only recognition. And across the room the movement resumed, papers shuffled, voices rose again, but the tension that had once filled the space had dissolved into something quieter, something reflective. And as Elijah stood, the room seemed to adjust around him, not because he commanded it, but because his presence carried a stillness that reshaped the atmosphere itself. And he walked toward the exit without haste, each step steady, unhurried, the polished floor reflecting the soft outline of his robe. And when he reached the door, the outside light greeted him in a warm, steady glow, the kind that does not rush, does not demand, but simply exists. And just beyond the threshold a small figure stood, waiting, the child from the church, shoulders slightly tense but no longer trembling, eyes fixed on Elijah with a quiet trust that had endured everything that followed. And Elijah stepped forward, lowering himself slightly, so their eyes met on the same level, his hand resting gently on the child's shoulder, grounding, steady, the same gesture from before, unchanged. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be said, the silence between them full, complete. And behind them Hayes watched from inside, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, a man who had begun the day certain of his role and now stood in the quiet aftermath of understanding something far more complex. And he did not step forward, did not interrupt. He simply remained there, allowing the moment to exist without interference. And outside the city moved as it always did, cars passing, people walking, the distant sound of life continuing without pause. But within that ordinary motion something had shifted, something that would not be visible to most, but would remain, carried in memory, in decision, in the quiet space between action and reflection. And as Elijah and the child turned together and walked into the fading light, their figures slowly blending